Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to Transforming 45. I'm your host, Lisa Boat. In this podcast, we dive deep into the transformative power of storytelling. I firmly believe that stories have the magical ability to heal, inspire, and connect us. That's why I'm here to bring you the incredible stories of women who have journeyed through life's ups and downs and emerged as their most authentic selves. We'll explore stories of resilience, reinvention, and the courage it takes to embrace change. It's a space where authenticity shines, where the messy and the beautiful moments of life come together to create something truly extraordinary. So, brilliant listeners, get ready for a roller coaster of emotions, a burst of inspiration, and a whole lot of love. Transforming 45 is not just a podcast, it's a movement, a celebration of incredible humans who light up the world. I'm so grateful you are here, and I can't wait to embark on this transformative journey with you. Let's dive in and start transforming together. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Transforming 45. This week, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Schuler to the show. She is the founder of Inner Evolution Coaching. And we had a conversation a few weeks ago, and Liz uses a lot of really interesting modalities in her work. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well.
That's great. All right. So, Liz, tell us, who are you and how did life introduce you to this version?
So right now, I am an international traveler and coach and yoga therapist. I'm a little bit of a wounded healer. And so how I got here is a bit of a long and meandering story. It starts in Wyoming in the USA, where I was born and raised and had kind of a lot of childhood trauma going on. And so when I was about 16, I figured out that yoga was something that would help me. I had a lot of injuries. I grew up on a farm, doing hard work and things. So my back had been injured. And yoga was the one thing that helped with my back pain. And as I continued doing yoga and learning about some other like Reiki and other alternative therapies, I noticed that it wasn't just my physical body that it was changing. It was also a lot of that trauma and that stuck emotional wound that it was starting to heal. So that was amazing. I started out wanting to be a vet. And then when my first horse died, I was like, I can't do this every day for my job. So I looked for other ways that I could heal and help people. And that ended up being counseling and psychology. So I did that. I went through my bachelor's and decided I wanted to do counseling instead of psychology because I wanted to help people right away. So in the US, it's a little bit different than around the world. In the US, if you go into psychology, it's a little more research-based. If you go into counseling, it's like right into helping people. So I did that. I started working with adolescents in residential treatment for about 3 years while I was doing my master's. And then after my master's, I went straight into private practice, teaching yoga and doing a bunch of like Reiki certifications and things like that. And in 2015, my partner sort of randomly got a job offer in Jordan, in Amman, Jordan. And so we left. He got the offer 2 months later. We were in Jordan. And it was very crazy. Yeah. And so from there, because I was in private practice, I kind of continued a little bit of that private practice, but I needed something else. So I went into international school counseling. And I was there for 4 years almost, and then moved to China to do kind of the same thing, have a small online private practice, and then doing counseling in schools. And we ended up in China right in time for the pandemic.
Oh, great.
Yep. So we had about 6 months in August to December of 2019 where things were okay, and then all hell broke loose, right, for everybody in the world. And then we were stuck in China until we decided we were going to leave. So we left in June of 2023. So about 7 months ago, and now I'm in Belgium. And those last few years in China and in schools really showed me that I needed to do something a little bit different. I moved schools from Jordan to China because there were some things that were going on in the school that I was like, I can't do this anymore. This doesn't feel okay to me anymore. And I had heard from other professionals, well, it's not all schools, right? If you get a good school, it's fine. And then when I went to China, that message sort of changed. It's like all schools are kind of like this. All schools have the politics and the, profit, and not necessarily looking out for the students 100% because of other things that are going on. So the last 2 years that I was there, I really did some soul searching and figuring out what I wanted to do. And I decided I wanted to become a yoga therapist and do coaching so that I didn't have to do like DSM diagnosis, and I didn't have to deal with insurance, and I could just help people heal in the way that I knew worked for me and that I've seen work for other people. So that's kind of the short of how I got here and who I am.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I keep saying at the beginning of these episodes, your story is my story. Our story is everyone's story, because
Right.
although I haven't traveled to different locations to live around the world, I mean, that part of the context is different, but there is always that moment in everyone's story where what comes to the surface is, I just can't do this anymore. And there are a number of times where you're talking, when you first said you wanted to be a vet, and then it's like, you're a bit younger than me, so I don't know if this reference will make any sense to you, but the Never Ending Story, do you know that movie? That ended so I still hold so much trauma just from that scene in the movie.
Yeah, what we're talking about.
So anyone who was around my age will remember, like, in June in the 80s, we just watched movies at school.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what we did.
Yeah,
Basically,
right.
for the last 3 weeks of school, we just watched movies.
Yeah.
And grade 4, sitting in that class, watching The Never Ending Story, and absolutely being destroyed. My sensory memory of that is so strong. I was never the same again after those moments. So I can completely relate to, there is something in the animal connection that is so deeply moving.
Yeah.
That I can relate to what you were saying.
Yeah. And I think it's very interesting. Animals have a way of being there for you non-judgmentally in a way that humans have a hard time being, right? You don't feel judged by an animal. So, and there's like a purity there.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And I've had a couple of people on the show who do animal communication work. And after talking to them, I really started to notice how animals do communicate, right?
Yeah.
I've always had that sense and that feeling. But even just, so we have one new dog who lived in a kennel for the first 4 years of her life. Yeah. So we're doing a lot of work with her around building up her confidence, around because she is afraid of everything and everyone except for me, essentially. She's starting to warm up to the other folks who live in our home, but it's taken some time. And just the work that I do with her every day of looking at her and saying, you are loved. You are smart, you are strong, you are brave. That affirmation that I give to her also has this repercussive effect on me that is really, really powerful.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So there are a lot of intersections in our story around the education system. And I think it's an interesting time for this conversation, in that there is something that is happening within all of our institutions right now. And I would really love to hear your perspective on that, as you have been in it in multiple places on the globe. So what are some of the things that you were seeing that existed in all of those places and brought that feeling up to the surface of, I just can't do this anymore?
Yeah, it's very interesting because you think of, okay, so I've moved, to a halfway across the world, things are going to be different. But the international schools have really pulled that USA American education system into their sort of fabric. There are some that don't do this and do, some more European type things or something different, but most of them are doing like the IB program or an American diploma, right? Because a lot of people want their kids to go back to the US for university.
Right.
Very prestigious. And I've noticed that the US idea of the Protestant ethic of like you have to work hard, and if you don't work hard, then there's something wrong with you and you're worthless. That is a huge part of that. And not just for, the workers, the teachers, the staff, but also for the students. And that's not healthy for anyone, right? It's not a healthy work environment, it's not a healthy learning environment. And so kids become burnt out, teachers become burnt out. But then there's this hierarchical top down, well, but this is your job. Why aren't you doing better? What's wrong with you? Not what's wrong with the system. What's wrong with you?
Yeah. And I think that is I think that is sort of the foundation of this conversation. And it is that turnaround of what is wrong with you, right? When systems are starting to break down,
Yep.
their role is to maintain status quo, right? Like that is their job. And I had this conversation on the show with another guest around what happened to me, and that was, in pushing back and trying to change the system, it saw me as a threat and took me out just like an immune system would, essentially. And that is what happens. And it creates this sense of tension within all of the people who are in that system. And we can see that happening if we go back to the question of what is wrong with you from the system perspective. We can see it happening in systems not just education, but healthcare and politics and all of the foundational structures in our society.
Right.
We're seeing this destabilizing happening. And I think the key to getting people to really look and ask the fundamental questions that need to happen right now is knowing that is the system's job, right? The system's job is to make you think that you are the problem.
Yep. Yeah,
right?
definitely. And that was a lot of the work that I ended up doing with teachers. School counselors usually don't work with teachers, but when you're in an international setting and there aren't really any providers, you tend to kind of have some of those teachers come in and talk to you, especially if you have any sort of mental health training, which nowadays school counselors have a lot more than they used to. But yeah, it was a lot of, this is a system issue and you can push back. And if you push back, there's probably going to be some consequences. And if you feel like you can handle that, then that's fine. But otherwise, there's not much we can do. And it was very parallel to a lot of the kids that I worked with who were in, homes with abusive families where there's not a lot of resources, right? Even in the US, you have CPS, but that's not always helpful. And so there's a lot of how can you survive until you can get out?
Yeah, which is really, really hard and can have consequences on lots of levels, right? Not just for ourselves, but for those who are in our care when we, as the care providers, are in survival mode.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So I'm interested, what do you think it might take in order to shift people from asking the question of what is wrong with me to what is the conflict in the system?
Yeah, I think that one's a tough one because especially if you're brought up in America, right? I know that it's taken me a really long time to let go of the idea that if I'm not productive, then I'm worthless, right? I think a lot of people now call it internalized capitalism, and it takes a lot of work and it takes other people who are willing to see it and call it out for you. Because in a lot of systems, the people who are starting to understand that feel crazy, right? Like my God, am I the one that's crazy here? Am I like, I feel like this should be different, but maybe not, you know?
Uh-huh.
And then you have all of these other people who don't quite realize that what they're doing is trying to keep that status quo, right? That homeostasis. And so they're pushing on you, like, no, you are the crazy one. And so having people that even if it's online, if it's, somebody that you can reach out to tell you that you're not crazy, that's really important. Really,
Yes.
really important. Because as soon as you realize that it's not you, that you're not crazy, that what you're asking for or what you need or what you're seeing is actually the thing that's crazy, that really helps you with there's decisions, there's options. You can do things about that. When you're crazy, right? And you're the only one who's feeling that way, it feels like you're trapped and you can't do anything you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to look at this from both. So educators are feeling that way within the system.
Mhm.
Students are feeling that way because they are seeing that so much of what they're being asked to do is of the past, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And for parents, I think it's also very challenging because there is this us versus them in the system,
Yeah.
right? And I have straddled both of those things because I have been within the system and I'm also a parent.
Yeah.
So for listeners out there who are parents and are feeling powerless,
Mhm.
it's a difficult line to walk, right? Because there's a lot of noise around parents being helicopters and of,
Right.
there's no faith in the
Right.
educators and they're like, and that there is an element of that is true.
Yeah.
And at the same time,
Right.
they are advocates for their children. So I can share like my personal experience currently. I have a child who's in grade 12
Mhm.
who and is the cohort of kids who was in grade 8 when the pandemic started. And so didn't really have an uninterrupted high school experience until grade 11. So they haven't had experience in writing exams. They haven't had the experience. They've had very limited experience even with what a regular cycle of a year would be.
Right. Yeah.
And so now it's exam time. And parents out there who are going through this, I hope that you can relate. It is exam time. They are working so hard and their stress level is really high. And we know what happens to the brain when stress levels and cortisol are high. They're absolutely incapable of rational thought. And then they're being held to the same standard as anyone that has ever come before them. And it is causing huge mental health issues for our kids. It's having repercussions on what their futures will be.
Yep.
And it's a really hard time to navigate the conversation because yes, I want to support the educators around holding kids responsible and accountable to things. Yes. And context matters.
Mhm.
These are not the same children as the last time there was a round of exams.
Right.
And so I'm interested to hear from you. Like, what would you give to parents as a way to advocate for their children in a way that they can be heard?
Mhm. Yeah, that's really hard right now. Really hard because
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes, it is.
the teachers are also right in that survival mode, that fight or flight,
Yes.
right? They're flipped. I use the Dan Siegel flipped with the kids all the time, right? Their
Yeah.
prefrontal cortex isn't working either because they have all of these things from admin and, federal standards and their state stuff going on and all of this that they're just like trying to get through to. So I think the best way for a parent to advocate for their kids right now would be to be gentle, right? When you're coming on an animal that's scared or frightened, right? You don't go straight into knock it off. you know? And it's got to be the same with the teachers. And it's difficult because it's their job and they should be there to be making sure that your kid is doing a good job. But we're all human and we all have, these fight flight modes in our brain that we can't always control. And they've got a lot of other stuff that they can't control. So just, being like, hey, I want to talk to you about whatever it is, right? The testing or my son. And they're going to probably be defensive right off the bat, right? And if you can just sit and listen for a little bit, and I tell this to teachers too, with parents, right? It's the same thing. If we can just sit and listen for a little bit and then say, okay, so here's what I'm hearing. And you can tick off what they're hearing, what you're hearing, what they're saying. And then, okay, so here's where you're at. And here's where I'm at, what I'm seeing with my kid, what I'm seeing at home. And hopefully, as soon as you have said, oh, this is what you said to me, the teacher will calm down a little bit, right? Because they'll feel heard, and they'll know that you're not there to attack them, right? And if you can make it not about the teacher, but about the work or about the test or about what you're seeing at home, that'll be a lot easier for them to take too. And I know that a lot of teachers, when they're hearing these things from parents, probably in their head, what's going on is, well, but admin said, right?
Uh-huh.
And when they say that, well, but the policy is, right? For teachers, that is teacher speak to parents, that you need to talk to the principal instead, because they don't have the power to deal with that. And they're not allowed to say that in a lot of schools, right? They're not allowed to say, I don't have any control over that. That's an admin decision, right? If they say that, they'll get in trouble. So as soon as you hear the words like policy, where there's not really much I can do about it, that's your cue that they don't have any power over what it is that you're asking about, and you need to talk to the principal or need to figure out a district thing.
I think that's really helpful advice, because the people who are the first point of contact are in a really difficult position. And I think it's becoming more challenging to be really self-reflective and aware, because as a globe, we have been in an activated state for a long time. And when that happens, it starts to feel like normal in your body, which is really, really problematic. Because it's bad for your body, and it makes it really difficult to have that kind of rational thought in a conversation that is emotional.
Right.
Okay? So what is some of the work that you're doing right now with yoga therapy in using your body as a healing modality?
So yoga has been shown for, I want to say the last 30 years now to be one of the best trauma treatments that we have. But for some reason, we just don't use it. And the reason that yoga is so good is because it moves your body. It has you breathing in a very specific way. And when you're doing both of those things at the same time, you are showing your brain that you are perfectly safe. There's nothing wrong. And you are coming from the brainstem up to deal with the trauma, rather than just trying to think your way through it, right? Thinking your way through trauma doesn't really work, which is why when people go through cognitive behavioral therapy, it'll work for 3 months, 6 months, and then you kind of revert back, because we hold a lot of that trauma in our cells and in our DNA. There are epigenetic studies that show that mothers who've gone through trauma that haven't resolved that trauma can pass that on to their children, and then their children are really anxious for no reason. And they're like, I don't know why I'm anxious. Nothing has ever happened to me, right? But it's because mom had trauma and is passed on. And so if we can use yoga, the movement and the breath, to really dig deep into that trauma, and you have to have both, right? You need the bottom up, you need the top down, you need to be able to think about it, and you need to be able to feel it, really, really feel it in your body. And yoga therapy can do that by having you do very specific movements, especially while you are talking about your trauma. So for a lot of my high school clients, when I was dealing with that, we would do like child's pose. So they would be talking about this thing that's really heavy, stuff that's going on at home, whatever it is. They're like, I'm feeling really upset. I'm really unsafe. If you go into child's pose, what it is your knees are up in here into your chest and your head is down. So you're protecting everything that's really, really vulnerable on your body. And your brain says, oh, I'm protected. I'm in a little fetal position like I was in the womb, right? This is a really safe place. And it calms everything down. And the other way that yoga is really helpful is it's a mindfulness practice. So when you're doing yoga, when you're doing a flow, or when you're doing just a straight up practice, the point is to be very, very mindful and be focused in on what your body is doing and what your breath is doing. And mindfulness, if you do it consistently, helps shrink the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that flips, gives us that fight, flight, or freeze, and helps strengthen that prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, the brain that can help with decision making and things like that. So there are a lot of things that yoga does. I mean, I don't think that's everything, but
yeah. Yeah, because we didn't even touch on the spiritual connections,
right? Yeah,
that are a real part of that practice as well. And there's a couple of things that I really want to pull out, and I want to come back to yoga and the amygdala and prefrontal cortex,
great,
and how it can really be used with teens.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I want to put a pin in that for a second because I want to come back to it.
All
But
right.
I also want to go back to what you were talking about when mothers are pregnant and how trauma can be transmitted to children. And this is not blaming moms
No,
in
you're
any
so
sense of the word. No, and you didn't come across that way. I just want to make sure we're like,
no.
you and I both are very clear. This is not about blaming mothers at all. And it's really important to know, especially in a world where young humans are entering, that were gestated in a very, very stressful time.
Yep.
And the name of the book is Determined. I can't remember. Dr. Richard, I think.
I think I've heard of it, but I can't remember it right now.
Yeah, me too. I'll look it up. I'll put it in the show notes.
Great.
But he is the leading scientist doing this work around the repercussions of elevated cortisol and the environment that the mother is in when they are gestating a human, and the long-term impacts of that on that human. And so it is the scientific reason for generational trauma to continue itself. And it also can be situational.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's something that we need to be really aware of, because one of the things that traditionally we have done as humans is we blame the generation.
Yep.
Right. Who has had a very different experience. It's like, well, it's their fault.
Kids these days.
Exactly. Yeah. Kids these days, they're just, whatever, fill in the blank with whatever derogatory thing you want to say about them. But moving forward, it's going to be really important for all of us to understand this, that we have a generation of kids coming who were gestated in cortisol soup.
Yep. Yeah. And the thing about it is, they don't even have to be gestated in that, right? If there's trauma that has happened to the mother, and those genes, it's the way that they describe it so that's easy to understand is it's like a switch, right? You switch a gene on and off. And if you've got that gene that switches on and there's that anxiety and that hypervigilance, you flip those on. If you get pregnant, you have a chance, whatever the genetic chance is, of passing that on to your child, even if you have a perfect pregnancy, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important for especially people who work with young people, right? Teachers, educators, counselors, to understand that it's, if there's nothing that has happened to that child, but they're still feeling anxious, that doesn't mean that something hasn't happened before, right? Mm-hmm. Or that, they're just crazy, or, there's no reason for this, it's pathological, or whatever it is, right? There's probably a reason. Just because you can't see the reason doesn't mean it's not there.
Yes. And that's true for young humans, and it's true for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. So the reason I think it's so important to talk about this is that the grace that we can show ourselves in knowing this is
Yeah.
then the grace that we can share with younger generations who are coming up, because this doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It
Right.
means that we need to really know this information so that we know how to interact in a way that doesn't just continue to pour gas on the anxiety fire.
Yep. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So then in that conversation, yoga in working with kids and
Yeah.
teens would be really, when you said it shrinks the amygdala and strengthens the prefrontal cortex, I was like, what a great
Yeah.
modality to use with teens then, whose prefrontal cortex isn't quite online
Yep.
in the moment,
Yep.
but giving them, like, helping them start building those pathways.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for parents to understand, I think, that their kids aren't, hormone crazy or whatever it has been, right? Just that
Mhm.
their brains are in adolescence basically like a construction zone, right?
Yes.
Think about, tearing down and remodeling your house. That's what's happening in their brains. And that's crazy, right? There's like so much stuff going on. And when we treat them like they're mini adults, right? So I think it's like 15 where kids are like, okay, now you're old enough to, right?
Mhm.
But somebody who's 30 years old is thinking totally differently than a 15-year-old, than a 19-year-old. They're not,
Yes.
their brains are not the same. So you can't just treat them as if they should know. Their brains
No.
don't function that way.
No, and yet we are asking them to make decisions, right? I think that that analogy that you just gave of the construction zone is really brilliant, because if anyone has been through a renovation that causes a massive disruption in their home, and in the midst of that chaos, you are still having to make decisions
So,
about, the renovation itself, as well as the rest of your life that's continuing on around it.
yep,
Every decision is just that much harder, because we are in a place where we are under construction, and that is stressful.
yep,
And yet we are asking young people to make decisions about their futures, about how they want to spend the rest of their lives. We are putting expectation on them that is perhaps unrealistic for what their brain development is. And then they push back and they lash out,
yep,
and we blame them,
yep. And we
right?
do we do all of that, and we still treat them like they're children. So it's like
Oh,
they're
yes.
both
Yeah.
adults and children at the same time, right? And they don't
Mhm.
they don't have a lot of say in what's happening to them. And so, yeah, it's really difficult to parent teenagers. I'm I'm not a parent myself, but I've worked with teenagers for like 15 years now, and it's difficult to parent
Mhm.
teenagers.
Yeah, it can be. It
Mhm.
can also be really, really amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that it is, like, the information that you're providing for people in really understanding how teenage brains work is the key,
yeah,
right? To being able to interact with them in a way that is informed by that.
mm,
And at the same time, it's important to give yourself grace
yeah,
around the experience that you are having, because it was the book Little Fires Everywhere. The author describes this moment
mhm,
where she looks at her daughter and sees the baby that she was, the young human that she is, and the woman that she is becoming. And when I read this, or I'm getting emotional now, when I read that line, I just dissolved, because
mhm,
that is so true. I look at my, late teenagers now. I have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, and I can still see this soft, sweet face when they were, like, born and when they were toddlers. And now I look at them and I see all their angles and how they are now, and I can see who they are becoming. And it's both beautiful and tragic at the same time,
yeah,
because as much as I love and appreciate the humans they are now, little squishy bodies, and I miss that time.
yeah,
And So I think it's important to be transparent with your kids as well about that and say, like, you are having a lived experience and so am I. And tell me about yours. And
Yeah.
then I'm going to tell you about mine. And then we're going to figure out how we can do this in a way that is respectful for both of the experiences that we're having.
Right. Yeah. And that's where I think, things like mindfulness and yoga and these interventions can be helpful for both parents and teens, right?
Yes.
Because if you can come to your teenager, your adolescent in a calm, not flipped state, it's going to be easier for them to also not be flipped, no matter what's
Mhm.
happening, right? If you have to have a disciplined conversation with them or whatever it is, if you can be, steady and calm, because they're regulating off of you still, right? Because their brains aren't done. So
Mhm.
as soon as they get that hint of, that fight or flight going on in you, they fully flip. Like they have no control anymore. So
Mhm.
having that feeling of being okay in that conversation when you come to your kid is really important. And if you mess up, that's okay too. The important thing when you mess up is to come back and say, I messed up, right?
Yes.
Sorry, my bad. Let's try this again.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that because it's also a really great way of modeling for your
Mhm.
kid that it's okay to do the same thing.
Yep.
Right? When we show them, like, no, I'm never apologizing. I'm the parent. I'm the, person who's in charge, which is what a lot of us experienced
Yep.
because that was the knowledge base at the time. Right?
Exactly.
When we do that, we don't show kids that it is okay to make a mistake, to
Yep.
come back, to acknowledge it, to name it, and then to say, okay, we're going to do differently next time.
Right.
And that is really that's what they need to see almost more than anything, that we don't have expectation for them to be perfect right from the beginning. Right.
Yeah.
I was in a session yesterday. It was about entrepreneurship and being, new.
Yep.
But what I found really helpful was it's like, no, you can't be perfect because you're a beginner. Right. And kids and young humans, I feel like that's a really great way to look at them as well. They're beginning
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah.
They're beginning. And so let's give them the grace to be that and give them the space to do all those things that we know beginners do. You make mistakes and you figure it out along the way, but there has to be safe space to do that.
Right. Yeah. And it's really important to model healthy relationships with kids because I think a lot of kids when they have parents who are very shut off and very much, the authoritarian parent, you will do as I say, when they have relationships later on in life, they feel the need to, kind of be a doormat or be a people pleaser or do those sorts of things. And it can get them into some really not great situations, especially as teenagers. I've seen a lot of teenagers who feel like an abusive relationship is okay, even if their parents aren't abusive, but their parents, don't show any of that vulnerability or say that it's okay to, not be perfect. So it's really important to show them that healthy relationships are about taking responsibility and not being perfect. We're going to hurt each other, and that's just
Mhm.
we're just human. That happens. But when we do, we're going to try and fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things I love about the work of Gabor Mate as well, which
Yeah.
I've probably talked about this on the show 1,000 times, but he talks about like, it's not our job to protect our children from everything.
Right.
It's our job to love them through the hard things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's really different
Mhm.
from what the societal narrative is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So again, when you learn that, and then you're going through the process of implementing it, give yourself some grace to feel whatever you're feeling about it, because it's going to feel uncomfortable.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And again, I wonder where yoga and yoga therapy would be a really good place to process those things.
Oh yeah, definitely. Coming into yoga therapy, I mean, I've had people process, really horrific abuse. I've also had people process like I'm burnt out at work, or, I have a family that is going through something right now and I just need, to process through whatever that is. And you can do that without having to go into like a DSM diagnosis or pathologizing. And that's kind of why I've moved away a little bit from psychotherapy and more into coaching and this holistic healing, because we can be open about it and there's no pathologizing. I don't have to give anybody, a label, and we can just work through whatever it is they need to work through, and it's a lot easier when you don't have to have whatever this label is put on somebody, for the system or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's very freeing, right?
Mhm.
I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day that was very much around this. And well, how do we shift systems so that they meet the needs of everybody? And I was like, well, if we can just approach them from curiosity
Yeah.
and say, what do you need?
Mm.
Right? I fully acknowledge that in the systems we have right now, sometimes we have to get the diagnoses so that kids can get what they need. I find it very frustrating, as I can hear in your voice, and it is a reality.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're the same.
Yeah.
They're the same person they were before they had the diagnosis. And when we ask them and work together to co-create
Easy.
what are the best conditions for you, that is how we actually shift systems.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for the
It's amazing what yoga can do with that, because when you're in your body, a lot of people, because of the way that our society is structured, it's very individualistic, it's very externalizing, right? Those labels are externalizing. We don't feel in our body. We're not in ourselves. And as soon as you start to get into your body and you start to feel your body, even if it's, uncomfortable or you're feeling pain, there's a shift that happens where you're able to really, I don't know, it's like you have choices again and you are able to be who you are again in a way that you weren't before, because you didn't know what was going on in your body. You were just like this external thing. You were a worker, you were whatever. And now you're here. You are here. I am me. And that's enough.
Yes. And your body provides you resources,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
That you can't access if you're not living within it. And some of the exciting things about the time that we're living in is that we are beginning to know so much more.
Yeah.
When you said earlier about you can't think your way out of healing, that's very true, because although in the past we thought it all happened up here, we now know that it's your gut that produces the majority of serotonin in your body. And so you need to be connected into your body to
Yeah.
be able to access those resources,
Yeah.
right?
100%.
Yeah, to acknowledge when I have pain somewhere.
Mhm.
And notice, well, it's not just pain for pain's sake that's coming from somewhere, right? For me, it's my mid back. And whenever it lights up, I now ask myself the question of what is causing you stress? Because
Yep.
that is my stress response, is that pain.
Yep.
And as soon as I ask myself the question, it starts to lessen.
Yep.
Whereas before, I would like really fixate on the pain, and that would just continue its spread, and it would go into a full back spasm. Exactly.
Yep.
But now I know that I can use my body as a tool to
Yes.
say, it's giving me a message. I have to acknowledge it. I have to ask myself the question, listen to the response, and then act.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, I keep bringing it back to yoga because this is great. When you're moving into a posture, you have to do all of those things.
Yes.
Right? And so it's a really good way to practice that. And a lot of adults and kids that I worked with were afraid of bodily sensations and afraid of their emotions. It's like the emotions and the bodily sensations are just information. They're not good, they're not bad. Really, the toxic positivity, it's good to be positive, but we don't need to be happy all of the time. That's not, feasible or appropriate. Our emotions give us information. Like, I would have never gotten out of schools if I didn't get angry, right? I needed to feel that anger to be like, this is not okay. like, I can't do this anymore. I got to do something different.
Yes. Oh, I totally agree with you in the same experience. But when I'm working with clients, the way I position anger is it's your body's way of telling you that you deserve better.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. So it is necessary information for us to feel and think through and process. And, when I think about yoga and the powerful message of that. So right now I'm doing this really intense weightlifting program. But what I have learned is that my perimenopausal body needs a little bit more time to heal. And so Wednesdays I've worked in a yoga flow instead of just like pushing through 6 days a week with
Mhm.
this program. And on Wednesdays when I wake up and I think about the workout that was supposed to be that day, and I go, oh no, this is my yoga day. My body goes, yes. And it is so happy to have that movement and sometimes it's still spicy. Sometimes I still work up a little bit of a sweat, which also feels good.
Yep.
But just that movement of being so conscious in my body, it's a gift. It's a gift that I give to myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Yoga is amazing. I love it. And I know that it's a lot of people, I think it's a religion. Very
Uh-huh.
interesting. It's spiritual. Like, it's
Mhm.
100% spiritual, but
Yeah.
it's not a religion in and of itself.
No.
It's more of a science, really. If you go
Mhm.
back into, some of the Vedas and some of the really founding documents, it was their way of doing biology and psychotherapy and psychology. And so there's a lot of parallels and a lot of really important wisdom there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really beautiful place to leave this conversation. 'Cause we could keep going forever, but
Forever, yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your experience and your
Thank you.
wisdom with us this week. And I will have all of Liz's contact information in the show notes below. Reach out for anything for yourself, for your kids. Yeah, and thank you so much.
Thank you. It was amazing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this transformative journey today. Your support means the world to me. If you resonated with our conversations and want to uplift the Transforming 45 community, here's what you can do. 1, subscribe and share. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you found value here, share it with your friends, family, and anyone seeking inspiration. 2, leave a review. On whatever platform you are listening on, your words can make a significant impact and help others find their way to these transformative stories. 3, connect. Join the conversation on my social media platforms. Follow me at lboat for updates, behind the scenes, and more heart-centered content. And 4, guest recommendations. If you know someone whose story could inspire someone else, reach out and let me know. I love connecting with diverse voices that carry the power to transform lives. Remember, it is your support that is the magic in my mission. Together, we can create a community of empowerment, growth, and healing. Thank you for being part of the Transforming 45 family. Until next time, keep shining your light and embracing your journey.